The wind howled through the cracked wooden beams of the cabin, rattling the door on its rusted hinges. Inside, Catherine lay weak and trembling, her sweat-drenched hair plastered to her forehead. The air reeked of blood and damp wood, the scent clashing with the sharp sting of whiskey James had poured on his hands before helping deliver the child. He sat on the edge of the bed now, silent and still, staring at the tiny bundle in her arms. Her daughter. Catherine looked down at the baby, barely more than a whisper of life, her wrinkled skin soft as candle wax, her breaths light and warm against her mother's chest. The child had barely cried, just a feeble wail before slipping into exhausted sleep. She was perfect, small fingers curled against Catherine's torn shift, her weight nothing at all, yet heavier than the world. James exhaled through his nose, the sound filled with something dark and bitter. He hadn't spoken in minutes. Catherine dared to glance at him, searching his face for something, relief, pride, even indifference. Anything but what she found. Disgust. His jaw tensed. His fingers, rough from years of hard labor, drummed against the edge of the wooden bed frame. "A girl," he muttered, his voice like the scrape of a boot against gravel. Catherine swallowed. "She's healthy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's useless," he spat, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against the splintered floorboards, the sound sharp and final. He turned his back to them both, pacing the cramped room. A goddamn girl. After all this time, all this waiting, Catherine felt something inside her splinter, but she held the child closer, shielding her from his words. "She's her daughter, James." "She's nothing," he snapped, rounding on her, his face a mask of fury. "Do you know what I built? What I've sacrificed? I needed an heir, Catherine, not another mouth to feed. She's our blood," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "She's ours." James scoffed. "Ours? She's yours." Catherine's breath caught. The room felt smaller, the air too thick to breathe. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees, but inside, all she could hear was the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards as James walked toward the door. He grabbed his coat from the peg, pulling it on with jerking, violent movements. "I won't have this," he said. "I won't waste another year waiting for a real child." She sat up, wincing as pain lanced through her body, fresh from childbirth. "James, please." He wrenched the door open, letting a blast of cold that made the candle flames dance wildly in their holders. "Get out." For a moment, she thought she had misheard. The baby stirred against her, letting out a soft, questioning whimper. Catherine tightened her hold. "What?" "You heard me." James turned, eyes like flint. "Get out of my house." The word struck like a rifle shot, reverberating through the small cabin. Catherine stared at him, searching for some trace of the man she had married. The man who had once courted her with promises of a future, of a home, of love. But there was nothing. Her body ached, weak from labor, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing against her ribs, the sudden knowledge that she and her child were nothing to him. "James, I have nowhere to go," she said, her voice breaking. "It's the middle of winter. If you send me out now, we'll die." He didn't blink. "I suggest you start walking before the snow buries the road," he said. She stared at him, stunned, waiting for the moment he would take it back, that he would soften, that he would tell her this was just his temper getting the best of him. But James Calloway had never been a man to regret his words. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open doorway. "Now!" Tears burned behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Not in front of him. She had begged once before, in the early years of their marriage, when his fists had taught her how little her words meant to him. She had learned that pleading only made him crueler. So she did the only thing left to her. She rose. Her body screamed in protest, her legs trembling beneath her. Blood stained the sheets behind her, soaking through the fabric of her nightdress, but she forced herself to stand tall. She held her daughter close and stepped forward, past the bed where she had labored for hours, past the fire that had once warmed her on cold nights, past the man who had once vowed to love her. Her bare feet hit the snow outside. The cold shot through her like knives. Her breath formed ghosts in the air. Behind her, James slammed the door. Catherine didn't turn back. The baby whimpered, sensing her mother's fear, but Catherine pressed a trembling kiss to her forehead. "Hush, little one," she whispered, though her own voice wavered. "Mama's here." She moved forward, step by step, into the night. The road stretched before her, a winding ribbon of ice and shadow. The wind screamed through the skeletal branches of the trees, rattling them like bones. Snow clung to the hem of her gown, soaking through, chilling her skin to the marrow. She didn't know how far she walked. Minutes? Hours? Her legs shook with each step, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel warmth trickling down her legs, blood. Too much blood. She stumbled. Fell. The baby let out a weak cry as Catherine hit the ground, her arms instinctively curling to shield her daughter from the impact. Pain flared up her spine, but she didn't have the strength to rise again. She lay there, panting, her vision swimming. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a warm home, surrounded by love, but here, alone, in the frozen dark, with only the wind to hear her last words. She turned her head, pressing one final kiss to her daughter's forehead. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then, from the darkness, footsteps, not the hesitant crunch of an animal, nor the hurried steps of a passing traveler. These were deliberate, measured. A shadow loomed over her. Catherine blinked against the swirling snow, her body too weak to flinch. A man stood above her, wrapped in a thick fur cloak, his face half hidden behind a scarf. Dark eyes met hers, sharp and assessing. The last thing she saw before the world faded into black was his hand reaching for her. The world returned to Catherine in pieces. First, the warmth against her frozen skin, then the crackling of fire, its orange glow pressing against her closed eyelids. The scent of wood smoke mixed with something stronger, something sharp and metallic. Her body felt heavy, her limbs unwilling to obey as she drifted between wakefulness and unconsciousness, caught in the fragile space between survival and surrender. Then a voice. "Drink." A rough hand pressed a tin cup against her lips, the scent of strong whiskey cutting through the haze in her mind. Her throat burned as the liquid slid down, hot and unforgiving, chasing the numbness from her limbs. She coughed, gasping for breath, and when she opened her eyes, she found herself staring into the dark gaze of the man who had found her. He sat beside the fire, his face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Snow clung to the edges of his worn coat, melting in rivulets down the thick fur lining. His jaw was covered in a few days' worth of stubble, his features sharp and unreadable. The rifle at his side was within easy reach, his fingers resting lightly against the worn stock. Catherine's breath hitched, and instinct sent her scrambling backward, her body protesting the sudden movement. Pain flared up her spine, hot and biting, but she ignored it, her arms tightening around the tiny bundle in her lap. The baby stirred, whimpering against the cold. The man didn't move. "Reckon you don't have much strength left to run," he said, his voice like the scrape of boots against gravel. "Not that there's anywhere to go." Catherine swallowed, forcing herself to steady her breathing. She took in her surroundings, an old hunting cabin, its walls thick with age, the scent of damp wood hanging in the air. A single cot sat against the far wall, covered in thick pelts, and a rickety table stood near the fire, cluttered with tools and a half-eaten plate of food. Her gaze flicked back to him, wary. "Who are you?" For a moment, he didn't answer. The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. Then, slowly, he reached for a small tin of tobacco, packing it with deliberate precision before speaking. "Name's Elias Blackwell." He struck a match, the flame flaring bright between his fingers before settling into a steady glow. He lit the tobacco, taking a slow drag before exhaling, the smoke curling in the air between them. "And you?" Catherine hesitated. The name Calloway still clung to her like a noose, but she wasn't that woman anymore. "Catherine," she said finally. "Just Catherine." Elias nodded, as if he understood. His gaze drifted to the child in her arms, and for the first time his expression shifted, not with softness, but with something unreadable, something distant. She yours. Catherine's arms tightened around the baby instinctively. She is. Elias studied them for a long moment before leaning back against the wooden wall, his posture loose but not careless. You were near dead when I found you, he said. Bled half your weight into the snow. If I hadn't come along, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Catherine looked down at her daughter, her heart clenching. Thank you. Elias didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for a knife resting on the table, turning it slowly between his fingers. The firelight gleamed off the steel, and Catherine tensed, though he made no move toward her. Who were you running from? He asked. The question was quiet, but there was nothing casual about it. Catherine felt the weight of James's voice in her head, the way he had looked at her before casting her out into the storm. The memories pressed against her ribs, threatening to crush the air from her lungs. She had a choice. She could tell the truth, or she could lie. Her fingers curled into the fabric of the baby's blanket, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My husband. Elias didn't react. He simply took another drag of his smoke, watching her with the same unreadable expression. You looking for you? Catherine hesitated. She didn't know. James had made it clear she meant nothing to him, but men like him didn't like loose ends. If he decided she was a problem, he would find a way to erase her. I don't know, she admitted. Elias studied her for a long moment, then exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Well, he said finally, you can't stay here long. Catherine stiffened. You're throwing me out? I'm telling you the truth, he said, voice flat. This cabin ain't mine, and the man who owns it don't take kindly to strangers. He's due back in a few days. You stay here. You'll be walking into a world of trouble. She swallowed hard. She had barely survived the first night out in the cold. If she had to do it again, she wouldn't make it. Elias must have seen the panic creeping into her expression, because he sighed, shifting his weight. There's a town a few miles east. Cold Springs. You make it there. You might find a place to settle. Catherine's throat tightened. I have no money, no family, nothing. Elias exhaled through his nose. Welcome to the West. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Then, before she could stop herself, she asked, Why did you save me? Elias's gaze flicked toward the fire. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, something worn and tired, something edged with ghosts. Didn't seem right, he said simply. Catherine didn't know what to say to that. She looked down at her daughter, watching the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest. The fire crackled, throwing light and shadow across the cabin walls. A few days. That was all she had, and then she would have to move on. The weight of it pressed against her, heavy as stone. But for now, she held her daughter close and listened to the wind howl outside. The wind carried the scent of pine and gunpowder as Elias guided the horse through the thinning trees, his grip firm on the reins. Catherine sat behind him, one hand cradling the baby against her chest, the other clinging to the back of his coat. The warmth of his body was the only thing keeping her from shivering, though she would never admit it. Cold Springs was still miles ahead, but daylight was slipping fast, sinking behind the distant ridge. Elias had wanted to move at first light, but Catherine hadn't been strong enough. Even now, her body ached from the journey, the stitches in her side pulling with every movement. She didn't complain. Elias hadn't spoken much since they'd left the cabin, but he kept glancing back, his dark eyes scanning the trees behind them. She noticed the way his fingers hovered near the gun at his hip, the way his jaw tightened whenever the wind shifted. He was expecting trouble. Catherine swallowed, tightening her hold on the baby. You think he's looking for me? Elias didn't answer right away. He urged the horse forward, his voice low when he finally spoke. A man like your husband doesn't let go easy. Catherine looked down at her daughter, feeling the weight of those words settle in her chest. Ahead, the trees began to break, giving way to open land. The valley stretched before them, bathed in the dying light of sunset, the distant silhouette of Cold Springs barely visible beyond the hills. They wouldn't make it before nightfall. Elias pulled the horse to a stop near a cluster of boulders, swinging down and scanning the horizon. His body was tense, his stance watchful. "We camp here," he said. Catherine slid off the saddle, her legs weak beneath her. She adjusted the baby's blanket, tucking it close around the small body before turning to Elias. "Is it safe?" Elias crouched near the fire pit left behind by another traveler, his fingers brushing over the old ashes. "Nothing is safe," he muttered. "But we'll make do." Catherine settled onto the ground, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. The fire sparked to life under Elias's practiced hands, casting flickering shadows across the rocks. The warmth crept through her, but she couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. Elias didn't look up. He tore a piece of dried meat with his teeth, chewing slowly before answering. "Had a sister once," he said. "She was about your age. Got tangled up with the wrong man." His jaw tightened. Didn't end well. Catherine didn't press. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them said. Then the snap of a twig. Elias moved faster than Catherine could track, his gun drawn and steady as he turned toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Catherine's breath caught. She pressed a hand against the baby's back, trying to quiet the quick rise and fall of her tiny chest. The night held its breath. Then movement. A figure stepped from the trees, hands raised in mock surrender. The firelight caught on the gleam of a silver badge pinned to a dust-covered coat. Catherine's blood ran cold. "Well, I'll be damned," the man drawled, his lips curling into a grin. "Elias Blackwell. Didn't expect to find you out here." Elias didn't lower the gun. "Keep walking, Dawson." The sheriff chuckled, tipping his hat back. His gaze flicked to Catherine, then to the child in her arms. Something dark flickered across his expression, gone as fast as it came. "Funny thing," he said, taking a slow step closer. "A man rode into town yesterday, asking questions. Said his wife ran off with his daughter." His grin widened, sharp as a knife. "Sound familiar?" Catherine's breath hitched. Elias's grip on the gun didn't waver. "You aiming to collect a bounty, Sheriff?" Dawson shrugged. "A man's just doing his job." The air crackled with tension. Catherine could hear the blood pounding in her ears, the fire popping in the silence. Then, Elias did something she didn't expect. He holstered his gun. Catherine stiffened, panic clawing up her throat, but Elias's expression was unreadable. He stepped closer to the sheriff, his posture easy, but there was something lethal coiled beneath the surface. "You want her," Elias said, his voice low. "Come and take her." Dawson hesitated, and then Elias moved. A flash of steel. A brutal, efficient strike. The sheriff staggered back, clutching his side, blood seeping through his coat. His face twisted with fury, but before he could reach for his gun, Elias struck again, knocking him to the ground. Dawson gasped, coughing as he struggled to push himself up. His hand found his gun, fingers fumbling with the grip. Elias didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, splitting the night wide open. The sheriff's body went still. The smell of gunpowder burned the air, mixing with the scent of blood and fire. Catherine couldn't breathe. Elias stood over the body, his expression hard as stone. He crouched, yanking the badge from Dawson's coat and tossing it into the dirt. Then, he turned to Catherine. "We leave now." Catherine nodded, her hands shaking as she pulled herself up. They didn't look back.